Okay, we're moving towards a new era, hopefully, optimistically here, where there's going to be a growing demand for psychedelic researchers and therapists, and hopefully some of you are going to be the lucky people who get to do it. As I think you all know, we're moving steadily ahead towards phase 3 studies with both MDMA and psilocybin, hoping within a matter of years, certainly less than a decade. Some of us optimistically think of 5 years of moving these substances from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, where they can be prescribed. And when we reach that point, there are very practical issues, such as can you come up with enough psilocybin? And who's going to implement this? Where are all the therapists going to come from if we're going to move into introducing psilocybin in hospice care and palliative care? And soon after that, in treatment of depression and treatment of addictions, and who knows what else, in both the United States and Europe. We need lots of warm bodies who understand this stuff, you know? I think often of the hospice movement, how back when I was in graduate school, doing my dissertation on dipropyltryptamine, a substance very similar to psilocybin, and cancer patients. The only hospice in the world was Cicely Saunders' place, St. Christopher's in London. And she was this idealistic woman who thought we could deal better with the way we approach death. And now we have hospice organizations, hospice training, Medicare pays for hospice care, et cetera, certification for hospice workers. Why can't that same thing happen with psychedelic treatment in research centers, you know? And I think we're going to live to see that. I hope this isn't going to be a chronic problem here. If so, we'll deal with it. So with that optimism, what makes a good therapist, researcher? One thing we certainly know to start off is the importance of genuinely being yourself. This isn't something you can just learn from a manual and do a technique. There's something incredibly important about being authentically yourself if you're going to be a good therapist. And there are many different ways of being authentically yourself, clearly. So the art is balancing, tuning into your own most authentic being, if you will, and knowing what others have learned from trial and error over the years, and balancing the current state of the art. I think we're early in the day here, that there's room for many variations of therapeutic styles, room for innovations, depending on how we come into the mental health world or the religious world, whatever. There's always preference for different styles of thinking, different language. We all have our favorite theorists, our favorite words to try to explain what's happening in the interpersonal dyad. So plenty of room for innovation. I would suggest that many of us will dive into this world and by trial and error discover if it fits, you know? Some people love being therapists, kind of sitting with the dying person for hours and hours without saying anything and thinking there's nothing more important I could be doing. There are other people who can't stand it for more than 5 minutes, who would rather do psychological testing or administration or whatever. And that's needed too. So I think to some extent, whether this fits or not, people will discover as they jump into it and experience it. And then I like to stress that we're all wounded healers. Don't ever think that you have to be perfectly self-actualized and enlightened in order to be a good psychedelic therapist. If there's anyone who would claim that, they're probably much too arrogant to be effective. We're all struggling, and by our wounds we are healed often. Looking for guides? I think we need someone who's skilled and trained, and choose your favorite word: guide, facilitator, therapist, monitor, attendant. Sherpa I kind of like, the guide, the guide through the Nepalese mountains who knows how to get up there safely. I think we need more than a generic sitter, even though you can define the word sitter to be more profound if you like. But it's not someone to just call the fire department if the house catches on fire, or to answer the door if the police knock on it. Someone who really has some knowledge of what's going on, who has some experiential knowledge of the inner terrain of the mind, most beautiful vistas, potential obstacles, challenges, variety of content, can cope constructively with anxiety and resistance. And this is a big one. It's true of all psychotherapy, really, but especially this form, to be able to establish very rapidly a very deep sense of trust and rapport with an incredible variety of human beings. And, that's more of an intuitive art, I think, than a science. I was just in London at the Imperial College, and I was walking through Hyde Park, and there was this group of people coming towards me of just wonderful diversity, different ages, different cultural backgrounds, different races. And I thought, what if I just grabbed 30 of these people, and they were the participants in my next research project. And I have 5 to 8 hours with each of them to establish enough rapport that when I give them psilocybin, if they feel they're dying or going crazy, they will just allow themselves to die or go crazy. That is an awful lot of trust to build up in a very brief period of time. But that's part of the art of doing this. And to some extent, it's true of any good psychotherapy. Has something to do with using self-disclosure very delicately, not using up a lot of time talking about your own life, but being known as a fellow human being who's real and not just a white-coated researcher. And basically intuitive sensitivity and the ability to communicate this non-judgmental acceptance that is so crucial to effective therapy with the psychedelics. Just simply being in the world together. I like to think a good guide is someone who has lived and is living fully, who's taken some risks, who has experienced some good failures, knows some of the agonies and ecstasies of the human repertoire, and who clearly is open to learning from experience and consulting to others. So this afternoon, I want to quickly take you through some definition of terms, phenomenology, zero in on some important experiential knowledge, some principles of navigating in the internal world, and maybe some valued skills. And then I want to show you a film, which some of you may have seen, but it's definitely worth seeing twice. Robert Barnhart's A New Understanding, the Science of Psilocybin. It takes two of the New York cancer patients and one of our non-cancer research volunteers and takes you through their psychedelic adventures in a way that communicates much more than another hour of me talking can do. And then as time permits, we may go into other realms here. We may prefer to use that time in just dialogue and discussion among ourselves. I clearly want to stress, as I suspect Jeff has, that we're not just talking about drug experiences. We're talking about very different alternative states of consciousness that are affected by setting, and dosage. You're all familiar, I think, with the terms psycholytic, psychedelic, and psychodelitic. Psycholytic being the low-dose therapy often used in Europe, where you give a low dose of a psychedelic several times a week to kind of speed up traditional psychoanalysis often. Psychedelic using a higher dosage, more support, aiming at the transcendental forms of experience. And psychodelitic, a word coined by Hemo Aronson Heijn, a Dutch psychiatrist, that clearly incorporates the best of both worlds, which is what we would do if we had these substances to use freely in clinical practice. I stress psilocybin may be viewed as a sacred molecule that provides an opportunity to access healing processes within consciousness and to discover new knowledge rather than as a drug that has drug effects. It opens a door, provides an opportunity. What one does with that opportunity depends on motivation, one's unique life situation, preparation, and the quality of the therapeutic relationship. It is no accident that indigenous cultures often refer to entheogens as plant teachers, especially in the ayahuasca communities in South America and the Native American church's use of peyote. When you take the sacrament, you go in to receive a lesson from the teacher. And it may be a very painful lesson, but it's the next step in your personal or spiritual development. Hermann Hesse's Green Door. I don't think Hesse ever took a psychedelic. He was one of these people like Abe Maslow that just didn't need to. Lucky guy. Some people just have these experiences spontaneously. Their own bodies maybe generate higher dosage of DMT than the rest of us. But Hesse says, in the magic theater of the mind, there are as many doors into as many boxes as you please, 10 or 100 or 1,000. And behind each door, exactly what you seek awaits you. I like that. It's from Steppenwolf. And there are doors that open into glorious spaces, and there are doors that open into scary places. But wherever it opens, the motivated, prepared person goes exploring. The basic alternate states of consciousness during the action of psilocybin and other entheogens. There's those with potentially positive import and impact here. The personal psychodynamic, the visionary, archetypal, and mystical consciousness, which I will explain shortly. Those potentially negative experiences that happen when people are not adequately prepared, of panic, paranoia, despair, and confusion, where you unlock material and then try to run away from it or control it. And if you want to have a good seminar in how paranoia is generated, as maybe all of us in mental health should have once, it's a great way to experience paranoia, but it's not really very helpful therapeutically, and it's really not necessary. But that happens a lot in the uninformed use of psychedelics, where people take the drug expecting to have a wonderful experience, and all of a sudden they're reliving the death of a parent or some deep guilt or whatever, and they fight it off and they try to avoid it and they try to keep their eyes open and run around and dance and talk, and they get more and more confused. And we call that a bad trip. It's really an invitation for personal growth, but the ingredients and the support aren't available, and the inner motivation isn't available. So it doesn't happen. And then there's these experiences of essentially neutral impact. I call it the tie-dyed T-shirt effect. The pretty colors, intriguing feelings, but it really doesn't have any profound meaning. The dosage is too small, or the motivation is insufficient to get anything significant out of it. The factors that are important in positive experience are set, setting, and dosage. I think you basically know this stuff. Set is unconditional trust, interpersonal grounding, and if there's some kind of religious framework or philosophical framework of entrusting your life to something bigger than yourself, however you choose to label that. Some people like the word God. There's a biologist, Edmund Sinnott, at Yale, who used to like to talk about the purposive properties of protoplasm. And if you'd rather entrust your life to the purposive properties of protoplasm, go right ahead. But there's a sense that there's something bigger than your everyday personality that's trustworthy. I like to stress the importance of choice, that when you take a psychedelic, it's not just being passive, like lying on the pavement as a steamroller approaches, It's a choice of a healthy ego that says, in this situation, with these people, with this drug, and with the purity and dosage I understand is present, with my preparation, my goal, I choose to be totally open, to take the risk, to trust unconditionally. The basic principle, you have to have an ego to lose an ego, Another part of set is openness, honesty, curiosity, where one is in life, your own personal psychodynamics, any estrangement from others or parts of your own ego. Encourage to explore, confront, suffer, learn, receive, and to go beyond the categories of understanding. Although it may sound like an excerpt from a medieval list of virtues rather than modern scientifically grounded guidelines, intention or mental set has been found to be of unquestioned importance both in the mind of the volunteer and in the mind of the therapist. Qualities such as honesty, trust, courage, genuineness, acceptance facilitate constructive healing experiences. Dishonesty, mistrust, cowardice, phoniness, rejection tend to have the opposite effects. And many have come to posit that a basis for ethics may be hardwired into our organisms. The setting is the physical, environmental world of providing, hopefully, safety, confidentiality. Some pleasant aesthetics help. Some skilled choice of music, which I could talk about for a long time. And the interpersonal climate is clearly non-manipulative. And someone know the secret here? All right. Thank you. Here's our lab at Hopkins. The first, we have two labs now, but you can see it's kind of furnished like a comfortable living room with a couch and nice art on the wall, good stereo system, kind of a cozy, safe place. And when someone receives psilocybin, they lie down on nice, soft flannel sheets with eye shade and headphones, and usually with two guides. This is myself and Mary Casamano and my son Brian, who is here in the purple or turquoise shirt. Just a mock-up of, but that's the way it generally proceeds. Then there's physiological factors, dosage. We know now through a dose-response study at Hopkins that for the average person, if you want to access transcendental forms of consciousness, you need about 25 milligrams of psilocybin per 70 kilograms of body weight. Below that, you're likely to have psychodynamic experiences and interesting aesthetic experiences, but you're unlikely to really tap into the death and rebirth cycles of the transcendental experiences. So dosage is an important factor, and it varies with the individual person. There are some people who can have incredibly high dosage in them and not experience hardly anything. I remember one engineer, obsessive compulsive guy who had 500 micrograms of LSD in his system and thought he saw the air flickering a little bit. And then there are these people who you just play them a little music the day before the session and they have a full-blown mystical experience. They don't even wait for the psilocybin. So very uncooperative people. Then this thing we call psychological resistance, the ability to let go. Supposedly, we all are producing dimethyltryptamine endogenously in very minute quantities most of the time. But when, maybe overly simplistic, but you can't help but wonder when these experiences occur spontaneously, if the organism has generated its own psychedelic substance, or the chemicals that would ordinarily suppress that are reduced, or whatever is going on biochemically. I don't even try to speak the biochemical language. I don't know it well enough. But that certainly is a factor. We know that intense stress and deep relaxation, as in deep hypnotic states or meditative states, tend to trigger alternative states of consciousness. I wonder if we've said anything, but both extremes seem to trigger it. That was Roland Fisher's research years ago. And at Hopkins, anyway, we have people discontinue SSRIs in that they seem to involve the same receptors as psilocybin, and I think a couple weeks. I'm not positive about that. Usually at the time of screening, they go off it. Yeah. Okay, psychodynamic experiences. This is the realm of conventional therapy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but it's confrontation and resolution of intense emotion, guilt, grief, sadness, anger, fear, regression, reliving of trauma, exploration of interpersonal relationships, and sometimes that's illustrated in visionary imagery, and sometimes it's very concrete people you recognize. Sometimes there's conversion experiences, as are well known in Protestantism, of kind of confronting grief and guilt and shame and giving oneself to something greater than yourself and experiencing some sense of rebirth and new beginnings and freedom, forgiveness. And I would call that under the rubric of psychodynamic. Okay, then moving into visionary archetypal experiences. There be dragons here. This is one of my favorite dragons. This is from Eduardo Luna's research center in Florianopolis, Brazil, ayahuasca. But it's a wonderful dragon. There are images. This is William Blake's God. This is Alex Gray's Christ, Kuan Yin, the Buddha, Shiva and Vishnu and consorts. Escher's wonderful painting of the mandala of nasty demons and very innocent angels, making one beautiful pattern. But there is this realm of imagery, often includes precious stones. How many of you know Aldous Huxley's little essay, Why Are Precious Stones Precious? Look it up, it's great. You can read it in 15 minutes. But his theory is that when you go into the mind, you encounter these images of precious stones. And that, he hypothesizes, is why we give these little shiny rocks to one another at weddings and special occasions, because they remind us of the visionary world within. Interesting hypothesis, anyway. Or the image of the diamond in Hinduism and many religious traditions, the unitive consciousness with countless facets, the one Brahman with 330 million deities dancing within it, okay? So you may zero in on any one facet at a particular point in a psychedelic experience. You know Sartre's No Exit? This wonderful play he wrote of a man and two women locked in a room forever, and they hate one another, but they can't murder one another because they're already dead. And the play ends with this line, "Let's get on with it." You know, but it's just kind of total despair. And there is one facet of the diamond that's the total despair experience, you know? And if you should experience that, my counsel would be explore it fully. You may never experience this much despair again, you know, savor it. It's like one of Dante's hells, you know, tour it, you know, explore every nook and cranny. And then the mind of its own will lead you to the next experience and the next experience. But that there is no facet of the diamond that we need to avoid or fear. If it comes as with a purpose. And with that orientation, psychedelic experiences invariably prove meaningful. Mystical consciousness. I've struggled. Sometimes I think this doesn't sound scientific enough. We should come up with another word. You know, Maslow said peak experiences, or we have all the words from the world religions of samadhi and satori and nirvana and beatific vision and fana and wu wei and so on. But I think mystical consciousness is a good term. It's sort of like love or God. You know, we may as well get used to it and define it as best we can and build it into our research vocabulary. But we know in this research that mystical consciousness is not something vague or misty. It's a very definite, clear, discrete state of human consciousness. And it's characterized by these 6 categories: unity, transcendence of time and space, intuitive knowledge, sacredness, deeply felt positive mood, ineffability and paradoxicality. which of course originate from my good buddy Walter Pankey and his Good Friday study, building on Walter Stace's mysticism and philosophy, and William James and James Bissett Pratt and other people in the psychology of religion. If you analyze the writings of the so-called classic mystics in different cultures through the ages, you can usually find these same 6 categories in their descriptions. Unity, the hallmark of mystical consciousness, seems to be approached in either of 2 ways. Internal, with eyes closed, kind of going through various so-called dimensions of being, and then being encompassed or merging with some kind of unitive consciousness. External unity with eyes open. I think Alfred North Whitehead captured it well, the sense of prehending, of kind of relating in the perceptual world until all of a sudden there's this instant where there's this sense we're all the same thing, or everything is made up of the same ultimate energy. There's some commonality in the world. So I think it's 2 roads to the same unity. Let me give you a few illustrations. This is a cancer patient, a man around 29 years old with 2 young children with lymphoma. He says, I first went to a place that seemed to completely lack the qualities of this world as we know it. I seemed to transcend time and space, and I lost complete identification with the real world. The experience seemed to me to be as if I was going from this world back to another world before this life had occurred. The actual changing from this life to whatever was before this life seemed to be involved in a very bright silver mass of energy with a very strong electrical current. Strangely enough, I felt that I had been in that mass of energy at one time before. When I was there, everything seemed to make sense. It was a very beautiful world, one in which love was very much a part. The basic theme that I perceived was that life continues to go on, and we are basically some form of essence from a supreme being, and we are part of that supreme being. I don't have the fear of death I once had. I am willing to accept the plan of the Creator and go on when it becomes necessary to the next segment of His creation. I have found that everyday living seems to be much more enjoyable. Small things in life that I may have overlooked, I seem to appreciate now. I have a much greater and deeper understanding of other people and a much greater capacity to try to fulfill other people's needs. Overall, I think I am a much more content individual. Having had the great opportunity to glimpse, for just a very short moment, the overall thinking of God, of possibly being brought into His confidence for just a brief period, to be reassured that there is a very beautiful, loving, masterful plan in the universe for all of us. And you can imagine how that type of experience is helpful to a terminal cancer patient, or to anyone beginning to realize that maybe you're mortal too, you know? Here's another description from an alcoholic who never went to college. The most emotional experience I had during the day was feeling as though I had died and was drifting into space, moving away from the earth. I started to become very uneasy and nervous, and then the clouds seemed to move aside for me to pass. I was terribly frightened. I felt so alone out there all by myself. Sometimes I seemed to be moving much faster, the clouds parting more swiftly. I wanted very much to go back, but I knew I could not. I began to drift more slowly now and had become more calm. Clouds had gone by. From here, it is very difficult to explain. There was nothing. It was like slowly drifting into empty space. It was so beautifully bright you could see nothing. Then far off a small cloud or flower appeared. The beauty and colors were so intense it brought tears to my eyes, but I could not turn away from it. I stretched out my arms to encircle it, but it was growing like a beautiful flower. It became larger and larger until I could no longer control it. Then it burst into such magnificence and beauty as everything seemed to open up. I was laughing at the happiness it gave me. I screamed as I pointed. It's so beautiful, you can't see it. At that time, I thought I was God, but I couldn't be. This was God, and this must be heaven. I became very confused again. If God were here and I was here, I was God. God was me at that time. It seemed all men were here. We must truly all be one. I thought this is what has been said of eternal life. But you can see the everyday intellect trying to digest this profound experience. And what words do you use? What categories? It's and one more here. You never guess this is from a cancer patient who was a poet. Early on, the visuals came and dissolved so quickly I could not verbalize them in time. There were countless variations in what reminded me of the ceiling of Westminster Abbey, Gothic, vaulted, great intricacy. These images changed with lighting, color, texture. I had no doubt I was in the presence of the infinite because I felt an overriding peacefulness that carried me through everything, even the very few seconds of yikes that showed up. I had a sense of losing my observer. I no longer witnessed the images, I was becoming them. This was not exactly creepy, but I did hesitate a minute, feeling my way slowly. There was a sense of being engulfed. Am I about to be possessed? Is this okay? I love this bit. I was unwilling to just hand over my body. I said, if we do this, I want my body returned to me in at least as good shape as it is now. The reply came, do you think I would disrespect my own handiwork? I got the point and went with it. My body lit up all parts in succession. It was the brightest thing I have ever seen. I glowed brilliantly from within. My whole being fluttered. I felt like I was being breathed through or played like an instrument. Stunningly beautiful. I got that every part of all of us is sacred. There is no speck in the cosmos which is apart from this breath. The point of it all is sheer pleasure. The world is a misery out of love, presenting us with constant opportunities to find our way home. I am seeing myself in everybody and everybody in myself. Is that a nice description? Then with open eyes, here's a description. Profound feelings of unity, first with a tulip, then with a rose. When looking at the rose as an object, it seemed to come alive before my eyes. Its petals seemed to breathe as slowly and gracefully they unfolded, seeming to express the ultimate in beauty. Fascinated, I watched these movements of cosmic gentleness until suddenly I knew the rose. That is to say, I somehow became one with the rose, no longer existing as an ego passively viewing an object in its environment. Although in the objectivity of my critical mind, I knew there were no physical changes in the flower, subjectively I seemed to see it in a totally new perspective, one which elicited tears and deep feelings of reverence. The rose seemed to stand out in naked beauty, as though it were the only thing existing in the world. Supporting the ancient monistic school of thought, I expressed the insight that we are all the same thing. Once I sought to express my experience by speaking of becoming one with the very essence of roseness. Another time I commented, there's more to beauty than we know. Here's Moses with the burning bush, which Walter Houston Clark, psychologist of religion, used to theorize was an experience of external unity. Here's another experience in an auditory mode. The various pieces of music were wonderful because they were multidimensional. I could hear tiny variations and subtle changes and shadings of the voices and instruments, as if I were inside the mind of the composer as he heard it. There was a sense of the composer touching the divine and channeling its perfection down to the human level so that other people could be aware of it and uplifted too, but simultaneous awareness of the impossibility of the task. As imperfect human beings, imperfect instruments, and imperfect voices are involved, somehow all of that imperfection was also woven into the perfection that the music was channeling. I was inside the music, the composer, the players, the singers, the shaft of the woodwind, the metal keys of the woodwinds, and the fingers pressing the key. Transcendence of time and space. This is the drawing that my partner Edna Emmett made for the cover of my book, which I appreciate. One of Alex Gray's paintings. But just the, this is a woman, Alice Kelly, that I just chanced upon on the internet and kind of like. But there's a sense that not only that you're unaware of time, but that somehow consciousness is outside of time. That this is what religious language calls eternity, or mathematical language calls infinity. Then there's the noetic quality of good old William James, which I like to stress, and that's why I call my book Sacred Knowledge, Psychedelics and Religious Experiences, because these experiences are more than glorious emotion. And there's nothing wrong with glorious emotion, you know, but there's also knowledge. There's intuitive knowledge. And whether that's that knowledge is a big delusion, or whether it's metaphysically, ontologically valid, we can debate forever, you know. James, the great pragmatist, says, let's not worry about that, let's just look at the fruits. By their fruits you shall know them. Does the person who have this experience become more compassionate? Does he have, or she have, less anxiety, less depression? Does the interpersonal world open up? Is there less preoccupation with pain? Is there more tolerance for diversity, etc.? If so, maybe this experience has value for us. Okay? What is known intuitively? The most common insights are the reality of God or transcendence. Fill in your favorite noun, ultimate reality, the void that contains all reality, on and on. The relativity of time. This is a big one, the indestructibility of consciousness. A feeling, especially in these days where it's fashionable to think of the brain, of consciousness as secondary to brain activity. So that when a person dies, you would assume consciousness stops, right? Who knows? We'll find out when we get there. But within these mystical states, there's usually an intuitive conviction that consciousness is indestructible, that it somehow is not subject to time. But we still don't know what we are. We don't know what consciousness is. So that's just one of these big mysteries we're living with at this point. Another common intuitive insight is the spiritual connectedness, interconnectedness of us all, which certainly would make for more world peace if there was more awareness of that. In Hinduism, it's called the net of Indra, but this sense that we're all somehow within consciousness interconnected. And we're all brothers and sisters, whether we like it or not. The absoluteness of beauty. Some of these geometric mandalic patterns and images of gods and goddesses are just stunningly beautiful. And we see them with our eyes closed. What's going on? You know? How is that possible? Like we wouldn't believe it if we hadn't experienced it. Another common insight is the primacy of love. This sounds incredibly idealistic. I think Dante at the end of the Divine Comedy says, "It is love that moves the sun and other stars." Maybe he's writing out of his own mystical experience. I know he probably didn't take psilocybin, but he might have had some moldy rye bread, I don't know. Or maybe he was just one of these natural mystics. But Dante knew what he was writing about. And there often is this sense or reports that the ultimate nature of the energy that makes up reality is love. Certainly is a beautiful thought. And then the wisdom, entelechy of the psyche, I'll come back to that. And these whole mystical experiences just have such a intensity about them. Like they're intrinsically self-validating. You don't have to convince other people about them, but within yourself, generally you choose to believe it. Yes, sir.